Hello all you lovely cosmonauts, as always I am Cosmic, and today I wanted to do a little video, just a short video, to talk a little bit about the Crytek Black Sea acquisition by SEGA. So for those of you who don't know, Total War developer Creative Assembly and their publisher SEGA have basically bought the Crytek Black Sea studio. Now for those of you who know a little bit about Crytek, they are a company obviously who were behind games like Ryse, and they have suffered financial trouble for a long time now, with developers going unpaid and problems internal and external, and it seems like they are now selling off the assets. SEGA have now bought one of their studios, which is the studio that was based in Bulgaria, and it was comprised of 60 developers. And so that studio, Crytek Black Sea, has now become Creative Assembly Sofia. So Creative Assembly are bolstering up their workforce. So the first point of this is that it's a great news announcement in the fact that 60 jobs have now been saved, because who knows where Crytek was going to end up in the end without selling off certain assets. You were talking probably massive layoffs, lots of developers losing their job if they didn't find a buyer. So thankfully that team has now been saved. Those 60 people get to keep their jobs, and that is all good in my book. Now while that is all well and good and it brings warmth to one's heart, it is not what gets me excited. What gets me excited is the fact that they've already announced that the new studio will be working on a number of unannounced projects. Now this coincides with SEGA also purchasing certain IPs that Crytek owned, including, and I say including, Ryse. Now for those who remember Ryse Son of Rome, it was a game that received mixed reviews at best. Now I have to say, I recently returned to Ryse Son of Rome after talking with Crytek from Angry Centaur Gaming, and we talked about it on a podcast recently, and it got me thinking about Ryse Son of Rome again, and I went to replay it just to re-experience it from a different perspective, and it was a game that I found enjoyable. I hated the story. I thought that the inclusion, it just went really strange, it went really supernatural and spiritual, and I just thought that detracted from what the game could have been in terms of this really good third-person beat-em-up with, set in a Roman Empire at war. And I thought that alone was enough to sell the game and could have created a really interesting in-depth story about the political intrigue of the time, about the war of the time, but instead it went in a completely opposite direction that really just didn't sit well with not only a lot of critics but also a lot of players. Now while I certainly didn't enjoy the story of Ryse, I thought that a lot of the core mechanics, a lot of the visuals, they were absolutely sublime, and I just think that they needed a little bit of innovation, a little bit of, more time, more love into the core mechanics and flesh them out enough to make a really interesting game. Now what interests me most about SEGA and Creative Assembly acquiring the rights to Ryse is that could this then be a new reboot of the franchise, and could they take Ryse, or possibly take what Ryse was in terms of its core mechanics, and turn that into a Total War franchise game? Now, some of you may remember that this isn't the first time that Creative Assembly have tried their hand at third-person hack-and-slash games. There was a time back in 2005 when Creative Assembly, like Crytek, tried their hand at putting a spin on an ancient warfare third-person hack-and-slash, and Creative Assembly did this in the form of Spartan Total Warrior, which was supposed to be a sub-genre of the Total War franchise. And when you compare Ryse Son of Rome with Spartan Total Warrior, there are a lot of parallels, and there is a surprisingly number of pitfalls that they both fell into. Because Spartan Total Warrior, the plot revolved, similarly to Ryse Son of Rome, around a warrior. And in Spartan Total Warrior's case, it was a Spartan warrior who was secretly guided by the god Ares. Similar in Ryse Son of Rome, that warrior was guided by Gaia. And it's a really interesting parallel to how these games were made in terms of their stories and narratives, and also why they received mixed reviews, because Spartan Total Warrior received also mixed to average reviews, in pretty much not only citing some of the core mechanics, but again, a lot of people didn't really dig the story, particularly when it's coming from a franchise. They're going, this is a Total Warrior which is part of the Total War franchise. Now, the Total War franchise before, at this point especially, was historically based. There was nothing to do with supernatural, there was nothing to do with fantasy, it was strictly historical based. There was, Rome Total War, there was Shogun Total War, and then they moved and took this idea of Total War, put it into third-person hack and slash, which at the time I remember being really excited about. And I was really excited to experience a Total War game from a soldier's perspective, from a individual perspective, and it went completely the opposite direction and just went completely fantasy, which again took away from what this game could have been. Similar to what happened with Ryse, Son of Rome. So what we have is two IPs from two different developers, both having very similar themes narratively, both having very similar flaws mechanically and narratively. And it makes me wonder, why did Sega purchase an IP that frankly did not perform well on the market? And I keep coming back to this idea that maybe, just maybe, that Creative Assembly are either going to reboot Ryse as something completely different, or they're coming back to the idea of creating a third-person hack and slash beat-em-up fighter, whatever you want to call it. They're coming round to the idea that they're going to do this again, perhaps with the Total War franchise. Now, that in itself gets me very, very excited. And I have to say that one of the things that I hated about Spartan Total Warrior was the fact that it was very button bashy. It was a game where you could just literally button bash your way through, whereas Ryse was a little bit of the opposite scale, where it was more quick time events and a little bit slower in its combat. And I would like to say somewhere between the two, where there was actual skill involved in the combat. And I think if they did bring this back somehow, whether it's a reboot of a Ryse franchise, or they're going to incorporate Ryse into a new Total War franchise, I think that there's massive potential within that realm. However, it has to be done right. They have to look at both of these games and go, well, what did people not like about that? People did not like that you went full ham on the fantasy aspect. People wanted a third-person game where you get to live and breathe the Roman or Spartan Empire. We want to be involved in that world without all the, real-life fantasy crap. Yes, incorporate the mythology in there in terms of what people do based upon their beliefs, but don't bring me a living version of Ares. I don't want to see that. I want to see what the actual time was like, experience what was to experience at that time. And I think that there's massive potential for a really interesting game that could potentially be the start of another franchise for Creative Assembly. In an ideal world, what I would like to see is Creative Assembly taking Ryse, Son of Rome, taking how they made that game in terms of its combat and improving upon it. I would like them to see taking the graphical fidelity, the voice acting, the animations of that game, because they were really fantastic for the time. And I would like them to take that, reboot the Total Warrior franchise, but take away all the fantasy crap. Leave the mythology in there, but take away, the living actual gods. Give me something that I can experience the time. Give me a Rome game that I can experience the job of a centurion, and give me an interesting world to explore. I would really love to see them create a world where you had really great combat, really interesting skill-based combat, have some RPG elements in there, perhaps have, make it open world like The Witcher 3, perhaps, or even not. Even if you didn't make it, even if you made it level-based, have a system where you had a squad of characters, each with, individual stories and that kind of thing, and just make it a really strong narratively driven game with really great core combat and an amazing visual audio experience. And I think there's tons of potential for Creative Assembly to do this with the acquisition of course, Creative Assembly Sofia and the Ryse IP. And it certainly makes me wonder what they're going to do in the future. And that's all for this video. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section below, whether you think that they're going to reboot the Total Warrior franchise, whether you think they're going to reboot Ryse Son of Rome, or maybe they're just going to sit the IP on a shelf. Who knows? Let me know what you think. As always, if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, make sure to subscribe, share on social media, and I will see you next time.